everyone. In this latest episode of Innovation Insights, we're really pleased to have James Devine with us. He's the CEO of the Medway NHS Foundation Trust. James, thanks for joining us today.
No problem. Good to be here.
Fantastic. So we understand that you're doing a bunch of really exciting things in regards to innovation at the Trust. You're involving all sorts of different stakeholders. But before we get into that, do you mind just sharing a bit about you, what your role entails, what's strategically important to you at the minute?
Of course, yeah. So as you say, I'm the Chief Executive at Medway NHS Foundation Trust. So we're a hospital in the southeast of Kent. We serve a population of around 500,000 people. We employ about 4,500 staff and a budget of around 300 million a year. Your point about what's important, I think, has probably changed over the last year, unsurprisingly, with COVID and the impact of that. Although I think there's still similar themes. I think workforce would have been a topic for us to consider importantly and strategically a year ago, 2 years ago, and perhaps it's more important now than ever before, but for very different reasons with regard to how we take care of our workforce in the NHS because of the last 12 months and the impact. I think alongside that, I think quality of care is always going to be a priority for us. But I think one thing that's really, I think, good that it's emerging, perhaps more so than ever, is the introduction of technology in the NHS and how that can support both workforce and quality of care. So that's certainly been our focus over the last 12 months. As we head, hopefully, into sort of better times from a COVID perspective, we can really start to embed some of those changes in practice.
Okay, James, so you're talking about technology accelerating into the NHS. I'm assuming that, like many organisations, the acceleration's somewhat caused by COVID-19?
Yeah, I think no doubt the pandemic has certainly, I think, accelerated some introductions of technology. So you and I previously talked about outpatients, for example. So outpatient work has traditionally been done in very much the same way in the UK for a long, long time, or certainly in the English NHS system, which is you receive a letter and you come into the hospital, you see a doctor and you have follow-up appointments thereafter. Clearly, we couldn't do that during COVID, so we moved pretty much most of our outpatient work onto an online portal, which for large groups of our community, that will be a preferred method going forward. It's certainly more efficient for them and in some respects more efficient for us. There'll always be a group of patients that can't have that type of care, but it's certainly something that I think will stick post-COVID, that we will accelerate our work around outpatient and the innovation with having that type of interaction between patient and doctor or patient and nurse.
Yeah, I can really see that being an impact on so many levels, just as you were talking about it there. I know I find a hospital quite a stressful environment because of the connotations it has of, people that mean something to me in the past being there and being ill. So the whole ability to not have to go back into that place that can cause stress and stuff, and it being more in your dealing with it in your own home environment seems actually like it's beneficial to the patient on that level too.
Yeah, definitely. I think we forget sometimes because we work in hospitals every day. For me, this is 25 years this year that I've worked in the NHS. So hospitals are pretty much day to day for me. But for you and for others, they have different types of memories. Sometimes it's relatives passing away, so quite sort of negative connotations. But actually, sometimes it's just quite scary places to come into. So I think we're perhaps respecting that more, acknowledging that more now post-COVID, or as we move into a post-COVID world. That perhaps there are better ways in which to engage patient groups. And I would say that if you take the learning from other parts of Europe, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, this is fairly common practice actually, that the introduction of technology into healthcare is much more advanced in parts than it is perhaps in the English NHS system. again, not a criticism. There are parts of the NHS that have fantastic technology, but at Medway, it hasn't been as great, I think, over the last decade. And we've made some headroad in the last 2 or 3 years. But certainly, I think as we head into the next 12 months, we will begin to see more technology supporting the provision of how and where we provide care.
It's really interesting because in the conversations we've had in the past, James, something that I've noticed in your leadership style is transparency and honesty with like where the organisation's are at in various parts of its journey. But don't you find that transparency is almost a part of innovation? Like you're only going to get great innovation if you're really transparent about where you need it and stuff. So do you find that certain important character trait to have amongst your senior leaders and managers when it comes to gaining innovation?
Yeah, I mean, as a leader, you can only be yourself, can't you? You can't pretend to be someone else. And for those that do that and try and emulate other people, it tends to fail because it's not authentic. So to your point about technology, I mean, unless you are honest about what your starting position is, and you hear it loud and clear, particularly from our clinicians, who I have to say are very rightly vocal around the frustrations that they have, right through to our our clinic clerks and our typing pool of individuals who, in some cases, are working with an infrastructure which is outdated, and they tell us, sometimes it takes 3 logins and two other passwords to get into a system, and that's crazy. You can go onto an app today, can't you, and spend thousands of pounds booking a holiday to another country. Yeah, in some cases here we struggle with modern day technology that supports how our teams can access even sort of fairly basic IT systems. So I think you've got to be honest about what the starting position is, but also be honest about what's realistic about where you can get to, because of course cost is always going to be a factor in the NHS. And maybe we've suffered a little bit from this kind of buy cheap, buy twice mentality. So we get the cheapest sort of version and then find in a few years' time it's failed or out of date. So we spent a lot of time in the last couple of years really thinking about our digital strategy and how we needed to, A, catch up, but also then perhaps take a big stride forward as well about what we're investing in over the next couple of years.
Interesting. One of the things I'll play back to viewers there is that it's this transparency that you have at that leadership level, which seems to create this open organization where you get a good flow of information coming up to you guys as leaders from operators within and clinicians in particular, where because they know you're transparent about the state of the organization, they're quite happy to contribute up into that reality, which is a perfect breeding ground for obviously solution building.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I get lots of messages and have regular dialogue with our clinicians, so doctors, nurses, therapists, and the like, frequently. I think the challenge for us as leaders is not just listening. You've got to do something about it. It's certainly not perfect, and we've still got more to do to hear more of that and then take action. But I hope that over the last 6 months, as we head into the next 12, our clinicians in particular will see that we have tried to get alongside, we are listening, and that we then are taking action to address some of the issues that they told us about. But we're not going to be able to fix everything, because we are dealing, as I said earlier, with in some cases a low starting base, which means the investment ask is a bit more, and it takes time as well to develop the right IT systems rather than just any IT system. So that's the importance of the digital strategy, because it sets out a really clear route map of where we're going to be over the next sort of 3-5 years as a hospital, which for the clinicians then is really easy, because you can look at it and say, okay, yeah, they've heard me. They do want to introduce an electronic patient record, but it's going to take them, maybe 3 or 4 years to get to an end point. But in the meantime, all of these other things are happening, which will make my life a lot easier as well. So we absolutely are listening to our clinical teams, but in some cases we need to catch up with them a bit.
It's really interesting, and I'll let the viewers know that I'm actually going a little bit off script here, because some of what James is saying I find really interesting. But in that, I hear that at Medway, you've got no shortage of suitable ideas coming from the ground up. Mm-hmm. Actually, I hear something about prioritization in there. And I guess, like, because we're speaking to a CEO, you very much got to where you are today, James, because you've got a good instinct for priorities. Can you give, like, our viewers any tips of ways in which you look at identifying a priority above, one from another?
So, as ever, I think with a CEO, you're only ever as good as the people that you have around you. And I think, part of what we've tried to do is create individuals who can do that, on my behalf or the board's behalf. So we've got a team here within our what we call a Medway Innovation Institute, which was not quite a separate organisation, but a product within the hospital, which is clinically led. Although we have our Director of Transformation sort of hosting it, it's led by one of our consultants and one of our matrons. They become the face of the institute, because that in turn then generates more interest from other doctors and nurses. So they see us all the time, but seeing doctors and nurses lead improvement programs and innovation certainly sparks their interest rather than us doing it. Yeah, exactly. And they bounce out. I mean, these are the people that will have the ideas. They see patients every single day. They know the frustrations that their patients have. They know their own frustrations. And I think when we developed the Institute, that is what we call the vehicle for change. And that means no idea is ever given a no. But what we'll do is what you're describing, which is, okay, what sits with our digital strategy? What sits with our hospital strategy? And therefore, what can we put some fast legs behind, whether that be resource or money, so people or money, to get them alongside the clinical teams and say, let's see whether this can really fly. So it's a bit like a sort of startup mentality that you think, there's an idea there. When you and I last spoke, I talked about one of our consultants having an idea about creating effectively a specialist centre here at Medway for something called deep infiltrating endometriosis. So it's quite a rare condition, but it's a condition that is really debilitating for many, many women and often can lead to infertility. So, and often, the woman wouldn't really know much about it in terms of fertility impact. So consultant gets in touch through the Innovation Institute and through a Chief Exec Scholarship, which I fund each year, to say, this is something that we believe our population needs. We don't have it currently. Can we get going? And by 2022, our plan is to have that specialist centre for deep infiltrating endometriosis here at Medway. Now, we don't have one anywhere else in the local area, so we'll be getting complex referrals in from elsewhere. And that consultant will go from sort of just having almost like a dream of creating this centre through to it becoming a reality, just because we were able to listen and get some people alongside him to support. So I don't think it's ever just me that has the role of prioritising. I might have the sort of the ink on the signature, but we've got a team of people here who get alongside and can fast track those ideas.
It sounds like you utilise a rich skill of leadership to help qualify based on their area of skills and expertise.
Yeah, I think in the leadership roles that we have in the NHS, we're sort of lucky in many respects, because in my team I've got a doctor, a nurse, I've got an operating expert, a HR expert, a finance expert, and whilst I might sort of play in parts of those gangs from time to time, they are the expert, the transformation director, and it's those people who then come together and say, okay, finance director, I can give you 10K to get that going. I need the ops director alongside and the nurse director, to get those people together and give people, you talked about authenticity, but it's also about giving people the autonomy and the empowerment to get going, but also acknowledging that some of those ideas will fail.
Absolutely.
So failure is, part of learning, isn't it? If we fail, then there's a quote, isn't there? I can't remember who said it, but it's something like, if you haven't failed, you haven't tried hard enough or something. So you are going to fail at some of these things. So let's create an organizational culture that says that we are going to get stuff wrong, but let's give it a good go.
And have you got any, in the spirit of talking about failure, can you remember a failure in your career that really taught you something, a lesson or anything? Or have you perfect?
No, definitely not perfect. There's probably loads, isn't there, that you kind of think through. I always kind of reflect on decisions that we make, and are they the right ones, or were they the right ones? And I think to your earlier point about COVID, we've had to make some really difficult and in some cases kind of really morally challenging decisions, across the NHS, for things that we've done or not done. And I think they're the ones that I think you think, okay, if this, I hope it doesn't, but if this all happened again, what would we not do again, or other things, what would we do quicker? So I think I think as a leader, you're constantly you should be constantly reflecting and learning on the things that you haven't done so well, versus things that you rightly have done sort of okay on as well.
It's a really interesting point, because I obviously speak to leaders every day and ask them about what innovation means to them. And quite often I hear, oh, it's new technology, or it's a new invention. But actually what you've spoken about there for me is like normal everyday innovation. Innovation to me is just doing something better than it's been done before. And so it's through deconstructing what's happened in the past, we can rebuild those modules to deliver better outcome the next time round. And that rebuilding is innovation in itself. So,
I completely agree. Yeah, completely agree. We were talking this morning actually with our culture team about how do we. So we've done lots of really good work, I think, on changing the culture at Medway over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. Medway had suffered in sort of 5-6 years ago of being in special measures. Came out of special measures in 2017. And since that time has made really good headroad in terms of improvement. You have a kind of a few sort of dog legs along the way, and the perfection path is never beautifully linear, is it? There's always things that go wrong, and we work in an industry where when things go wrong, they affect our patients and our staff. So they're never positive sort of positions, but a bit like a setback, you have to then think about how quickly do you react and acknowledge that you've got to get better. And part of that is the culture. I mentioned about ownership, accountability, empowerment, all those things that are part and parcel, I think, of good leadership. Our job is to then sort of push that down into the organisation so that it kind of permeates all the way through. It's a bit like that whole Disney story, isn't it, where they say or the NASA story, what are you doing here? And he's sweeping the floor, and they say, oh, I'm putting a man on the moon. We could be sort of twee and say the same thing here, but actually what we want is just for them all to describe themselves as leaders, because they are leaders of whatever they're doing in our organisation. So I'll give you kind of one really brief example that, whenever you see doctor and nurse programs on the television or hospital programs, the focus is always on doctors and nurses, right? That would be sort of fairly obvious. I always give the view that the doctor and nurse wouldn't even be able to go into the theatre unless it was clean. And that work is performed by our group of housekeepers. The patient wouldn't get to theatres if we didn't have one of our porters taking that patient. So we should be relying on our housekeepers, our porters. When a patient is in hospital, they don't get fed unless our catering team support the provision of good, nutritious food during a patient's stay. So actually then you start to understand that the leadership role is actually much bigger than me or the executive team. It extends itself right the way through the organisation, because if they didn't do their component part, the whole thing would fail.
So many patient touch points where you've got room for leadership in the depth and the breadth of the organisation. I love that. And I guess a dream would be that some people who support the hospital in some of those ways that you've talked about there end up watching this video, James, and on the basis that they do, have you got any kind of tips or tricks to them? Bear in mind that they might not be within your trust, of how you would go about elevating an important solution to an opportunity or a problem that exists in their area of the trust.
Yeah. So if you take the example of housekeepers or our catering teams, they have probably more interaction with patients than probably other or some clinical groups, because they see them fairly regularly throughout their time in hospital. And previously, much of our food booking system was manual. So I would give you a slip, and you would say what food you wanted. I'll take that back off you, take it down to the catering team. They would look at, and then bring your food up. So many different sort of manual touch points, and more importantly, manual points of potential failure. Yeah. If you sort of put your request in for a ham sandwich and then it all gets lost, then you end up with cheese. It's a big deal. So it's no different if you went into a restaurant where it's done electronically. So you enter the details and go straight to the kitchen, and then it's literally a pick up and then bring back up to the ward. And it's those sorts of obvious things sometimes, maybe not as innovative as the endometriosis example I gave, but certainly much more powerful in volume terms to the number of patients that we see, who it would be so much more beneficial to them to have it all done electronically. But it's a basic system that already exists in most restaurants in the world.
What I love about that example is it takes an unlikely area of the organization where you think innovation can come from, and proves that they have a touch point with your customer, a patient, and that touch point helps them to see a way that they can deliver a service to the patient that actually makes their stay with you much less stressful, and as easy as possible. And I guess that with that in mind, I might just ask you to talk a little bit about the kind of the vision, the purpose that you guys have, and how you find aligning the whole organization to that is like.
Yeah. So we have sort of a vision for the organization that we call providing the best of care through the best of people. Okay, so fairly obvious that our aim is to provide high quality care to our patients, but we only do that through hiring the best people to do it. So all kind of fairly obvious. And what we find is that, unsurprisingly, we have parts of our organization where that ethos, it just kind of oozes out in every single interaction. So our critical care department is rated as outstanding. So that's the highest level of regulatory rating you have in the English healthcare system. So rightly very proud. Our maternity services also rated outstanding. So these are areas which are literally the best amongst the best of services. The culture there is really strong. The leadership is very strong, but importantly, the quality of care is also very strong. But you come into other parts of the organisation, and they're still on that sort of trajectory to get to a better place, and they sort of have a lesser rating. It doesn't mean necessarily that leadership is poor or that the quality of care is poor, but there's more to do in sort of evidencing that, and for that to become an everyday reality rather than something which happens one day but not another. So when you try to sort of bring all these sort of business units together across the whole hospital, which there are probably a couple of hundred, you're not going to have this sort of one picture of the world, because you are dealing with very bespoke units within the hospital. I guess our test, or my test, is that where we've got outstanding areas, what can we learn from that one area, and how do we apply that to one that's probably needing a bit more support, which is something we've started to do, or beginning to do this year.
I don't know of anyone yet that I've spoken to throughout this pandemic where it hasn't completely kind of ripped up the rule book of how we go about business as usual. I'm guessing you're no exception. Now, James, you've talked to me in the past about your R&I strategy, but for people watching, would you just give a high overview of what that is? And in particular, I think what would be really interesting is what's come out of it. And again, when you talk about what's come out of it, I'd really like to know what the benefits were, because I think we often remove the disconnect between innovation and benefits, and innovation is to deliver benefits of some kind.
Yeah, completely agree. So we have a really clear, I think, innovation approach through the Innovation Institute that I mentioned earlier, which acts as that sort of vehicle for change and assessing and how we prioritize our interventions. But on the kind of more research side, and how we use an evidence base to support some of that, we've got again a very active research team who are constantly, not just leading research, but assisting in research from all, trusts up and down the country. Pre-COVID, that included things around patient outcomes. So sometimes that's looking in the UK, sometimes that's looking overseas and thinking, what are other parts of the wider healthcare system doing that perhaps we're not, either at Medway or in the UK. And I think one of the outputs of that was maybe 3 years ago now, we introduced something called robotic surgery at Medway. And it is exactly as it says, it is effectively a robot performing surgery, being administered or driven by a clinician, by a doctor. But that doctor doesn't need to be in the same room, and you could argue over time probably doesn't even need to be in the same country. And it's firstly, it's just amazing to think that can happen, that this can be functioned or facilitated elsewhere. But the benefits to the patient are the biggest ones. So firstly, it's less intrusive because the manual dexterity of the robot is such that you then have sort of less scarring. It's kind of straight in rather than scalpel and all those sorts of things. So it certainly is better for the patient. The outcomes for the patient are better. The length of stay in a hospital for the patient is shorter, and the recovery period for the patient is also shorter. So we invested in this, two robots. One that we used for training, because we only had one consultant initially who was able to work the robot, which he loved, because of course he was the only one doing it. But then he had to train other people, which he's now done. And now we provide training.
To share his robot.
You didn't want to share the robot? No, definitely not. And now we provide training to other hospitals for their clinical teams as well. But that was something which came again from one of our clinicians who talked about this robot, and now we're using it for a whole range of different surgeries, some cancer surgeries, urology surgery. So it's an amazing intervention. They have them, in the American healthcare system. I think they're fairly common practice. I think in the UK there's certainly more sort of coming online. But we did that clearly off the back of the evidence base that it was better for the patient to have robotic surgery than it might be to have more traditional methods of surgery. Alongside that, clearly for new emerging sort of junior doctors who are coming into the world of medicine, how much cooler is working a robot than doing it through the old-fashioned route? So it kind of acts as a sort of recruitment initiative as well, to say, come here because we're performing literally world-class surgery.
It's fascinating as well how you guys have pioneered something, but you're not like ring fencing that knowledge at Medway, that you're proud of what you've done, and actually you're telling stories that other trusts want to hear. And so you're accelerating this technology and ultimately the benefit to patients that go well beyond the boundaries of your Medway area, which I think is really cool as well. So I love it when an innovation starts small somewhere and then the ripple effect can be felt way beyond that.
Well, that's how medicine evolves, isn't it? Medicine is formed sometimes in really small parts, and then it only grows if we share. I guess, the COVID vaccine is a really good example of that, isn't it? Where, AstraZeneca through Oxford University developed, this one particular strength of vaccine, and that's been distributed all over the world. But that was developed, in a lab in Oxford. It's crazy, isn't it, to think that those geniuses have created, this vaccine, and it's shared across the world. And I don't think that's any different to how medicine has evolved more generally. And I think we've got, as all hospitals do, I think, is when they have something worth sharing, it's right that we share that to as many as we can, because fundamentally we're all here for the same reason, which is if our patients can have less stay in the hospital, they get better quicker, and they get back to sort of normal reality quicker than they would ordinarily, that's huge benefit to them and their family.
It's fascinating. And I've never really thought about it in those terms before, but you're absolutely right. The character traits of good innovation practice are almost baked into the NHS because of what you said there. It's that actually, as humans, we innovate in adversity. There's no greater adversity that we face than than something wrong with our health or the health of a loved one. And therefore, there's no more greater demand for innovation for this type of thing. So I love the fact that you've drawn our attention to the fact that actually, as a sector, I mean, you guys have been doing this, forever. That's pretty cool. Now, you've talked about your Innovation Institute. You've peppered it into some of the things we've said so far. How did it come about? What's the genesis for your Innovation Institute?
So I mean, it literally came from an idea of how do we attract clinicians to give us ideas about. It wasn't just about innovation; it was more about improvement at that time. And it started, as ever, with a conversation around, we're getting some ideas through, but are we connecting well enough with our clinical workforce? So, doctors, nurses, physios, all types of medical professionals. And I think we honestly felt that we weren't, and we needed to do more. But we also wanted it to be an institute that was, as I said, clinically led. So it had doctors and nurses primarily leading it. We could have set it up, tomorrow quite easily, put our faces over it and said, give us your ideas. We consciously didn't want to do that. We also engaged with a sort of a marketing sort of branding organisation, not to create, a logo, but to really understand what would be its purpose. Because it'd be very easy to create it and then for it just to kind of sit there and do nothing and just become a logo. So it came out of really sort of simple conversations, and then over a fairly lengthy time, sort of 6-8 months, it took lots of planning, and we were conscious that we didn't just want to open it and then it was, it fell flat. So, it literally has its own website. It still sits obviously as part of the organisation, but it has its own website. It has its own brand identity. It has its own sort of leadership structure within it. And all of that is designed in such a way that says it feels different and it looks different to what people might have experienced before. And that was a really conscious thing because if we'd done perhaps what lots of NHS organisations would have done, which is, I send out a note asking for ideas. Here's a sort of boring link to a very boring platform. It's those sorts of things that kind of sometimes put people off. It needs to feel exciting, and people need to be excited by it. And I think over the last sort of 6 months or so, people have been excited about the Institute, but more importantly, that they've seen the outputs. So we created a document. So our Director of Transformation created a document called The First 100 Days. And this was the commitment that we needed to show, almost a return on the investment almost of, we put all this time and effort. So what? And And the first 100 days document it's really inspiring to see what can be achieved and delivered in 100 days, but also stick. It's there, it's still in place today. People are still putting ideas through, and the one message is that we never say no to an idea.
I love that. It sounds like you've really started in the correct way, which is clearly define the purpose and make sure that that purpose is understood and bought into by everyone. And then in itself, it's kind of owned by everyone. What's great to see, and I personally would love to see more leaders recognize this, is that for me, this is a mandate from you to your organization, that innovation is like the engine room for change. It's that if you want to keep on being at the forefront of, you know, excellent patient outcomes and patient service, and be an incredible place to work, which of course attaches to the first point there, the better patient outcomes, then innovation has to be an engine room for that. And to actually go to great lengths to give this Innovation Institute its own identity, and also to kind of get various leaders to rubber seal it. I know that you mentioned earlier before, this hasn't just got the CEO's face on it, because as you pointed out, there's no way you can touch all, you know, however many thousand people are working for you, but your leadership team probably does.
Yeah, and can I tell you, the Institute does not have my face on it.
Yeah.
Conscious decision, it needs to look and feel different from the norm. It needs to look and feel clinically led, because that is what attracts clinicians to engage with other clinicians about the ideas that they're having. It doesn't mean that it's as a substitute for talking to me, because I would happily talk to any of our clinical teams as I do about their ideas and sort of reflections. But it creates that vehicle, as you say, to say, look, yeah, we've got this institute. It's working. It's delivering tangible benefit to patients. It's delivering tangible benefit to our workforce, and it's also investing, and in some cases heavily. So we put, roughly speaking, about £10,000 behind those priority ideas to get them going, acknowledging that we might need to come back, through a business case to do that. Our board signed off a 5-year investment program for our electronic patient record. So this is moving away from paper-based records through to electronic, which sounds alien, that doesn't exist already, but that means all records being on the online platform. Yeah, that's a significant investment for any hospital, and I would hope that shows not just our community but our clinicians that we genuinely, going back to what you said at the very beginning, we have those priorities of workforce. So we want our workforce to feel that they're working for an organisation that listens in terms of their frustrations. It will certainly improve quality of care, no doubt. And the enabler to those things is innovation or technology in this instance. So you kind of start to bring those kind of boring, sometimes strategic words into just a reality that if you give us an idea, we'll get alongside you and try and develop it. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. Those that don't, you either kick them to the curb and you move on, or you evolve them a bit more and say, actually, with a bit more tinkering, could we do something different with that? And the benefit of that, Charlie, is that because we engage so many different people, they all have different ideas. You're not working with the same group all the time, and that starts to bring a bit more energy, a bit more excitement, but importantly, more ideas.
And it's a really interesting topic, isn't it? Diversity and inclusion of thought is just so powerful to the end result that innovation should deliver. It's that whoever, historically we tend to design solutions as leaders in small, groups of people that look like us and speak our language, but we're often far removed from the coalface of that opportunity or that problem. Yeah. So, I mean, I imagine as a leader in the NHS, diversity and inclusion is always, you know, front of mind. Have you seen good depth and breadth of engagement from across the organisation? Is there room for more advancements there?
There's always room, isn't there, for improving sort of the whole diversity and inclusion agenda. But just pick out sort of a couple of specific parts. So your first point about diversity and inclusion of thought, I think is such an important concept. So if I think of my team, if I had 10 people who were all the same, you know, it could be quite hard, couldn't it, to manage 10 big personalities. And sometimes, I know we benefit here from our HR director, for example, who, you know, will often wait until all of those sort of louder people have had their say, and then all of a sudden he'll ask one really pertinent question that no one's thought of. And it kind of stops people a little bit, and then we kind of regroup. And it's that sort of thought processes that different people bring, I think is a powerful part to innovation, because sometimes you need someone just to say, have we thought about that? On diversity and inclusion, thought more generally, I think there's always more to do to get to particular sort of less represented groups in the hospital or in any community. And I would certainly like to see more in the way of engagement in some of those harder to reach groups. I don't mean just where we talk about ethnicity or race. I'm talking in the broader spectrum of diversity and inclusion. So, you know, this includes everyone having a voice in the organisation regardless. Because as you say, you know, the ideas will come often from, you know, one person making a really small comment that then sparks an interest in somebody else that then grows legs over here, and you know, you in the end start to create something, you know, which is quite powerful just by listening.
Yeah, I mean, an obvious one there is just extroverts and introverts.
Yeah,
Extroverts are very forthcoming with their ideas. They want to be known for them, and yet introverts don't have any less ideas. They're just not so loud with the megaphone about how good their idea is. So I think that's
I mean, part of the test of a leader, I think, sometimes is assessing who in your team is the extrovert versus the introvert, but also understanding how those two groups can work together really powerfully. And sometimes you want the extrovert to listen a bit more, and you want the introvert to maybe speak a bit more. But you have to kind of manage that, because you can't just chuck them in a room together and say, come back out with a great idea. And you've got to allow those ideas to sort of emerge and flourish over time based on how those two groups particularly work together. I don't know if you've ever heard of, there's a book called It's a Zoo Around Here. Yeah, so it's by a guy called Nigel Risner. And it's basically a bit like a psychometric test, but the end point is that it gives you a connection to a particular animal. And the good thing about this book is that it tells the animals how to interact with each other. So there's a monkey and an elephant, for example. The elephant is more the introvert and the monkey's more the extrovert. But what it does to the monkey is tell you how to interact with the elephant, and it tells the elephant how to interact with the monkey. And it sounds like a bit crazy over here, but the important thing is that if I'm a monkey and I run into the elephant's office, go, this is so exciting, I'll really annoy the elephant, and they'll just switch off. Likewise, if the elephant goes into the monkey's office and doesn't have some energy, the monkey has got like a bit of like a magpie syndrome, is already thinking of pretty things over here. So it's a really nice but really, really simple way of just kind of alerting us to some of the things that we perhaps need to stop ourselves doing that we do normally, and tells us how to interact with other people.
And I think that communication, again, is just an important ingredient in the innovation recipe. And so I love recommended reading. So let's make sure that we get that in the description in the YouTube channel, that recommended reading. Leave your comments on it. And if you've got questions to James, again, do fire them at us. We can forward them on to him, and if he gets time in the midst of COVID-19, we'll try and get some answers back to you guys. James, it's been an enormous pleasure getting you on camera and just you know, authentically sharing your views on these things. I think it's really important that we listen to one another, we share experiences, and we constantly keep innovation right at a kind of a North Star position. Like, innovation helps us get to where we want to go. And so whenever we can get someone at the top of an organization like yourself, you know, talking about that North Star alignment, it's incredibly useful. So thank you.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.